far in this module, what we were talking about was the requirements on individual directors. Okay, specifically their legal duties, the fiduciary duty around self-dealing, and then the duty of due care and diligence, and of course everything else. What we're going to do now is move up a level to the group, to the board of directors. What actually is it that boards of directors do to be effective, while the individual level of analysis that we've been looking at has mainly concentrated on the specific legal requirements, for want of a better term, even more of a compliance focus. Now we're going to shift into what the group has to do if it's going to perform effectively in corporate governance. So why don't we get into that now? We started this module by noting that there's some requirements of directors and officers. Why? Because under most constitutions in the replaceable rule, we find that the directors, and remember plural, so that means it's the board of directors, have the power in the company. The company is to be managed by or under the direction of the board of directors. In reality, though, we need to look at what that actually means. Because it's a plural, it actually means that individual directors don't have any power unless it's been specifically delegated to them, just like power is delegated to a manager. It is the group that has the power. So then what is the expectations of this group, and what's the expectations in reality? There's obviously a difference between governing and managing. That's why we have the two groups, and often lots of misunderstanding in governance comes from trying to articulate or understand and work with this difference. And a lot of that actually translates into expectations. A lot of the problems in governance comes from differences between expectations of managers that boards may have and expectations of boards that managers may have. So what does it mean to actually be an effective board? What is it that we have to do? Well, one of the things that we're going to discuss is the fact that it's very difficult to say you should do X. Okay, outside of those things like don't be dodgy, pay attention, legal compliance, what boards need to do varies with the specific contingencies facing it, the kind of company it is, the industry it's in, the current environment that it's operating in. All of these are going to affect what a board should do. Having said that, there are some trends. And one of the things this slide here is going through is the idea that even our understanding of what a board should do has evolved over time. Early on in history, we had a very different view about what a board should do compared to what we would expect them to do today. We see that partially reflected in the change of directors' duties, particularly the care and diligence now is much more active. A much higher standard of care and diligence is expected than what we would have had in the past, which I touched on briefly in one of our previous videos. But the second thing is there are these societal expectations of boards that have been changing. Why don't we have a look at how they've evolved over time, why they've evolved the way that they have, and also make a note that this general pattern of evolution is what we see within a company that's starting out, not just across time. So you'll tend to see this trend of development in a company as it develops and gets larger as well. So let's hop in and have a look at it. So when first companies started to come about, and that was in England with the Joint Stock Companies Act, which was around 1854 from memory, and there was the Limited Liability Act at roughly the same time within a couple of years, which set up the framework for companies. Well, you can imagine at that period who actually kind of owned the companies, right? Who were the key owners? Well, it would be the founder. Like someone would have had their company that they're running as a sole trader or as a partnership, and they would have put it in corporate form. In fact, there were some requirements on having a number of members, so it was generally the founder and their family. So these were kind of family companies. Who would govern or actually run the company? So who owned it? Who ran the company? Well, the founder ran it. So you have the owner also being the person in control. And at that point, who did you have on the board? Well, you'd have the person who owned it and ran it, and maybe you would have some people who would add some legitimacy, right? Someone who had a good reputation. So you might put someone, if you're over in England, you might put someone from the aristocracy on your board and pay them a bit of coin. And so therefore you can say, hey, I've got X on my board, we're a really good company. Okay, so people will put on there for reputation. A question I have for you, do we see directors put onto companies for their reputation still? And I would think, yes, we do. We definitely do. Okay, then what happens? Okay, companies then over the next, 50, 70 years start to develop. And what happens is the founders start to die out and retire, right? Particularly over the second generation of founder families. So what we start to have is a dispersion in ownership, right? We have multiple family members owning, or we sell to multiple shareholders. We also start to see governments starting to have some form of statutory corporations, right? Start to develop as well. So we have these different forms of company, plus also this dispersion of share ownership and corporations owning each other. So basically the share structure starts to change into a separation of ownership from control because we have professional managers arise. Okay. So what's going on in the board here? Well, one of the big problems when you're coming out of the Industrial Revolution, right? So we're coming out of the Industrial Revolution here, is we need access to capital. Becomes a key problem. And what we see evolve were these vast networks of capital, particularly in the US and through Britain and to some degree through Australia. For instance, if you might be more familiar with with the American networks, Rockefeller, Vanderbilts, etc. They had access to capital which could be leveraged during this period of history. So directors were often interlocking, so they were on multiple boards and would provide access to capital and opportunities. So their role was more resources and networking to allow professional managers to exploit the opportunities. Okay, do we still see directors appointed because of their accessibility? Yes, particularly when a company goes to list. You'll look for someone linked to the market so that they can provide some certainty, so a little bit of legitimacy, but also the links to the capital that you actually need. You also might need links to key customers, key suppliers. There's many resources that you might need. Directors can open those doors if you don't have people on the management team. Now, around the 1980s, we see two key changes in the economy. Okay. The first key change was the idea of marketing evolves. Prior to then, anything like marketing would have been called something like, sales, promotion. But marketing comes about because there's been a fundamental change in the economy. Prior to this period, the main problem facing business was to do things cheaper. Either produce it cheaper or get it there cheaper, logistically, right? Henry Ford with the Ford Motor Company, they can have a car any colour as long as it's black. What was he trying to do? Standardise to drive down the cost. Now suddenly we're starting to get this idea of niches and differentiating. Why? Because most of what we buy is largely cost won't make a difference. Think about something like, or even old technology like a DVD player. Like what could you buy a DVD player for? Probably $30, right? Think about that. Reducing the cost of a DVD player is not going to sell more DVD players. You have to be able to differentiate it. And that thing is full of lasers and technology in there, right? Things are so relatively cheap, we need differentiation. So one of the problems that happens because we have all of this money sloshing around is at the same time that we need to move to marketing, we find that there are fewer opportunities because the markets are being saturated. So corporations in this period, corporations go through a period of what's called unrelated diversification. There's some unrelated diversification. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means they went and bought other companies rather than developing the markets that they had. And there's a huge literature on how this can be very wealth destroying for shareholders. So a lot of money is being wasted in the late 70s, early and mid 80s on these unrelated diversifications. And so people start going, particularly investors start going, well, hang on. Who's checking that management's doing the right thing? And someone finally says, well, actually, we've got a board of directors. They should be doing that. And so what you can see is this is the period when the idea of the board being in control or monitoring management starts to rise, right? It had always been in the background, but there's a famous article in 1976 by Jensen and Meckling, and that the idea of agency theory starts to explode around this period in time. Finally, probably one of the last great trends that we've actually seen is the rise of institutional capital. Just think of superannuation. More than 10% of most people's money goes into superannuation. And where does most of that money go? Right? Into the same stocks or shares in the market. What this means is that there's so much capital in these institutions that they actually can't buy and sell shares without affecting the market for a couple of reasons that we could go into. They're a bit beyond this little video, but I'm happy to go into them. For a number of reasons, they can't kind of sell a share if they don't think it's performing well. They may affect the price, for instance, and so cause more problems for their holdings. So what starts happening? We start to see these institutional investors starting to put pressure on the boards around their performance, not just control. They start to say, hey, you should be making sure we're making a lot of money. Not just that we're not squandering money, right? Not just that we're not monitoring, but that we're actually making a lot of money. So as you can see, the idea of the main thing a board should be doing has changed over time as our economy and the structures in our economy have actually changed. Not only that, this is the general pattern that you'll see when a company starts from being founded, right? So a founder starts a company. If it's just them and their family, the company is largely a legal fiction. They run it, they're on the board, they do it. If they have anyone on there, it might be for a bit of, advice or legitimacy. Once they start needing to get capital though, once they need access to resources, then the people who supply those resources start asking for a seat at the table. So we get that networking advice and the legitimacy role ramps up. If they're successful enough and they diversify the shareholdings, then as they diversify, right, the board is expected to monitor more because we've got this separation of ownership from control. And finally, if we get the institutions involved, the pressure for performance comes. So this is a kind of natural evolution in what we'd expect of most boards too, at least in the emphasis in the role set that we would see in any board. In order to carry out these roles, one of the problems is that boards are faced with a paradox, right? On the one hand, they've got to stimulate growth and development for performance, but they've also got to have that control role to make sure that money isn't misspent. To do that, they've got to know what's going on in the company, but stand back and take a long-term view. They've got to be responsive to the shareholders and the environment in the short term, but focus on the long-term interests of the company. They've also got to be commercial and savvy and produce good returns, but acting responsibly towards all of its stakeholders. So there are these inherent paradoxes and tensions in the role of a board that make it very difficult to just come up with, in fact, I'd say impossible, to come up with this idea of a universal board set that would apply to all boards all the time in the same degree. Now, one place to start thinking about what boards do is legally. So is there any legal advice or legal opinion about what a board should do? Well, not really strictly as such, but there are some markers that we can look at from some esteemed legal authorities. One of those comes from the AWA case, where Justice Rogers, in a very famous judgment, set out what he thought the law would say the role of a board is. It's highly unusual that we don't get this a role set out like this in a legal case. But because of what he was dealing in with that case, he looked at it and said, look, boards are expected to set the goals of the company, appoint the CEO, oversee the plans of management for the acquisition and organisation of financial and human resources. I think that's judge speak for strategy. And then review at reasonable levels the company's progress towards those goals. Monitor. Set the goals, appoint the CEO, plan, monitor. If we look at all those, I think fundamentally the judge is saying the board needs to be involved in the strategy of what's going on, not just the monitoring and accountability. Another way to think about this role is through the work of Bob Tricker. Bob Tricker was one of the earliest writers in the area of corporate governance from the late 70s, early 80s. And he came up with this little model to try and explain what boards do. In this model, what he's saying is boards have a role that's based in the present and the past. Now, primarily, in the present and the past, what we're doing is monitoring. Right, you're monitoring what's happened or what has happened internally. Right, you're monitoring what's happening in the firm. But you're also accountable for what has happened. You're accountable back to the stakeholders, particularly the shareholders. Now, in terms of looking to the future, one of the things you want to do is make sure that employees don't do anything, they don't behave too badly, right? That's the role of policy formation. You're coming up with a set of rules that are meant to guide the future behaviour of the people within the company. So the board has this role in policy making, and then of course strategy. Right? You've got to think about what the company's going to do in response to the external environment. So Tricker came up with these 4 kinds of key domains of activity: policy, strategy, monitoring, and accountability. And all of that working with and through the CEO as the key employee of the organisation. More recently, people have come up with essentially lists of areas, lists of roles of the board. There's many. I think this one that we have here is a pretty good, pretty comprehensive list in terms of the things that boards do. So what is it that boards actually do? So the first thing on our list is that they determine strategy. Notice it's not saying they do the strategic planning, but they have to have some role in determining the strategy of the organisation, setting the goals, agreeing to it, testing it. Things like that are the very least that a board has to do to meet their legal requirements, as Rogers was talking about. Second point we've got there is, of course, looking after the CEO, making sure they got the right person, making sure they got a new CEO, mentoring the CEO, developing them, ensuring they're performing appropriately. Third thing, we've got to monitor all aspects of performance, clearly from the agency role, and also to make sure that we've got that strategic direction going the right way. We've got risk management, right? We've got to take care of the risks in the organisation, and 2 key risks that we actually can see in organisations many times would be compliance risks, Okay, risk is managed as more than compliance, but compliance plays a big role in the board, as well as the internal and external controls like audit. We've got them noted as separate points because they are so important in what the board does beyond all of the rest of risk management. And then we also have two other roles, that networking and providing access to resources role that we talked about in the evolution of the board. And finally, if there is a crisis, the buck stops with the board, so they have to step in. I think it was Mace who called boards essentially the fire brigade of the corporation. They've got to step in when there's a crisis. So I think that set provides a kind of articulation of the main things that boards do. Now, the level of emphasis different boards put on each of those varies with context. So for instance, if you're a large listed company, there's going to be much more emphasis on monitoring performance, right? Because we've got that diversification. Maybe oversight rather than involvement in the strategy. Small startup, you might be much more involved in strategy and access to resources, as an example. Okay, so hopefully you can see that we have this contingency approach where the emphasis on those different roles varies with the context of the organisation. The final point I'd make is that while there is this role set, the strategic role of the board is the most important. Why? It affects everything else. If you don't understand the strategy, you don't understand where the risks lie. You don't understand who the right person to be CEO is. You don't understand, well, I could keep going on, but you get the idea, right? At a very minimum, understanding the strategy of the organisation is absolutely fundamental to what boards do. Okay, so that should do us. We've looked at both what directors need to do in terms of legal duties and what boards generally do in terms of the roles that they need to perform. In the next module, we're going to look a little bit more in depth at how they do it. How do you structure a board to be able to perform these roles? How do you make a governance system work effectively? That's for the next module.